The problem with modern monetary theory is that it's neither modern nor monetary nor a theory. And it simply says, if you print enough money, we can all be better off. But what we know is, and history tells us, there are so many examples in history. If you print enough money, you'll get inflation. This is not rocket science. It goes back to David Hume in the 18th century. And, these ideas are fundamental and fairly obvious points to make. Now, that doesn't tell you what happens if you print 5% more money. That's a more complicated question. But if you do enough of it, you'll get inflation. It cannot possibly be a method for boosting productivity growth. After all, central banks can print money at will, either through printing notes or simply by buying government bonds and adding to the bank accounts of people in the country. But that doesn't do anything to improve productivity or anything else. The consequences have to be thought through. And if you're in a deep depression, then it may make sense to print more money and stimulate spending and get back towards full employment. If you're in full employment, it doesn't make sense to print a lot more money. And that's why it was very odd that during COVID, central banks around the world decided to do a lot of so-called quantitative easing, printing money, in essence. There was no need for it. Governments had already taken very substantial steps to borrow money and give it to people to tide them over the consequences of COVID. I think that was probably a sensible thing to do in the short run. But the consequences of this were twofold. One, central banks should not have entered the scene and stayed out of the action and not printed all the extra money. And secondly, as you said, John, that if you increase government debt too much, this is going to be a burden on our children and grandchildren. And we're in a world now where, our grandchildren are already facing substantial amounts of interest servicing payments to finance the interest that's going to be due on government debt. And it's not just in Britain. It's true, even more true in the United States and around Europe.
Yes.
So I think that the problem of debt is enormous. And the right approach to it is to say, if you're facing a war or a pandemic, you may need to borrow more in the short run. But then you've got to be in a position once that's over to see the ratio of national debt to national income slowly falling back again, so that when the next war or pandemic comes, there is room to borrow to deal with that emergency. But that's not what's happening at present. It is continuing to expand, despite the fact that we're back at full employment.